everybody, and welcome back to our second podcast. We're very happy to invite Joe Neale to talk to us, who will introduce himself in a moment. We're still during COVID, so obviously we're all sitting in 3 different places, but we hope what Joe's got to offer, we know what Joe's got to offer is going to be of interest to those of you in schools today. Joe. Hello.
Thanks, Margaret. So I'm Joe Neale. I'm the trust-wide English lead for the Schoolsworks Academy Trust, and I'm also one of the assistant heads at Downsbrook Primary School in West Sussex, in Worthing in West Sussex. I'm actually here on secondment from another school in our trust, so I've moved school mid-pandemic, which has been quite interesting, and I continue to lead English for the trust as well.
Mid-pandemic, that conjures up things, Joe. I think countrywide, worldwide, that's probably a phrase that resonates and is very clearly giving out all sorts of connotations. How's it been?
Well, I mean, that's a big question, isn't it? It's been different. It's been interesting. I think I've been lucky that I've, in a way, that I've been able to experience what it's been like at 2 different schools, and also at several schools as part of a multi-academy trust. It's been hugely useful, really, to have the support of a group of schools, because I think early on it was incredibly scary for schools. So to have the support of other schools and to be working as a group was really, really useful. Certainly in terms of leading reading and writing for a multi-academy trust, it's been very, very challenging, and I'm used to being able to go into different schools and work with teachers and support teachers with reading and writing, and to be able to do that without actually setting foot in schools is quite hard work. So yeah, there've been a huge amount of challenges for my role from that perspective.
And of course, with the new lockdown starting actually today, do you feel you're a little bit more prepared, or, are there things that now you know what it was like because of the previous lockdown, you can go in with a bit more confidence?
I mean, I think it's yet to be seen how it will impact on schools, and I think that in theory it should be very different, because we have children here, and touch wood, at the school I'm based at the moment at Downsbrook, we haven't had to send any children home. We haven't had to send any year groups home to isolate. So we haven't had to test our online learning platforms and check whether that will all work. But now we're in a position where it's all there and it's ready to go. Whereas at the start of the lockdown in March, it was panic stations. It was, we didn't know what we were doing. It was emergency teaching, really. It was just trying to get stuff out there. I remember at the school that I was at the time, it was, that we had those 2 days to get children passwords, and so that was make sure that they all know their password for accelerated reader, make sure they know their password for, at that point we were using Google Classroom, make sure they know their passwords for the various maths programs that they were using. And then we also were just making sure that they had enough books. So we were just handing out books to them. It was almost, I remember having conversations where we were saying, let's clear the library, let's clear the class book corners. We don't know how long these children are going to be at home for, so they must have reading material. And so we were just handing out piles of books to the children to take home and saying, read these and quiz on them, because that was a way that we could actually keep track of what they were doing.
Amazing. And you're right, at the moment the children are still coming into the building. Have any of the schools in the trust children home, or any sort of confining children to spaces?
Yeah, so we've had a couple of schools where there's been a positive case in a bubble, and they tend to have year group bubbles. So they've so the advice that they've then received is that those children should all go home for that isolation period. And interestingly, that I think just by chance they tend to have been younger children. So at one school it was the early years that had to isolate, and that then presents huge challenges for online learning. I think if you're trying to do it with children in upper key stage 2, it's a lot easier because they have much more independence to be able to access the online learning platforms that you might be using. Whereas with early years children, it's, especially when they'd only been in school for a few weeks, it's really tricky. And I know that those teachers found that quite challenging. And a lot of it really ended up being recording videos so that they could still see their teacher's face, so that they could hear their teacher's voice and try and sort of keep in touch that way. So the way that it would look in early years and key stage 1 is quite different to how I would see it working in key stage 2 when we need to do it.
Of course. And actually that feeds into the next question really, which is about resource and about laptops. I know there's been a lot of communication on social media about the laptop provision or not, and how children, particularly in some areas where there is maybe a phone and maybe a computer of sorts, if you've got several children, how does that pan out? What has been your experience of that?
So we put together a survey that we really took a long time to think about and to write, that sort of really covered exactly what kind of technology access children had at home. Because if you just ask the question, do you have access to the internet? The answer is likely to be yes. There are very few families that don't have any internet access at all. But when you dig a bit deeper, we were asking questions of, what does that internet access look like? Is it just a parent's phone, or is it a shared family iPad, or is it actually that each member of the family's got their own desktop computer that they can use and be doing work on? And what we found is that there are very few families that don't have any internet access, but there are also very few families where the child would actually have access to a tablet or a computer for any length of time. It tends to be shared, and so we can't assume that we're going to have children sat on Google Classroom all day, listening to what we're saying and interacting with us. It may be that they have times when they're allowed to do that, or when that piece of technology is not being used by someone else in the household. So we were able to find all that out, which is then hugely useful, because it means that when it comes to it, we can tailor our remote learning to make sure that it reflects the kind of access that those children actually have. And then in terms of things like the laptops that have been offered, we know that's pretty minimal, that we're not expecting to see a lot of that we've been told that we have access, I think, to 2 if needs be.
Wow.
It's not going to make a lot of difference really.
And does that mean then that teachers are thinking, or did they have to, create paper resources? I mean, how did you manage? How did you cope?
Yeah, so at the school that I've just moved from, we already had Google Classroom set up, which really, really helped. It wasn't particularly being used, but it was set up beforehand. And so we were then able to get that going. And really that was about, if you had a resource that you would have used that would have been a paper resource, then you scanned it, you took a photocopy of it, and we were able to put it onto that platform, which meant that even if the children didn't have a long time accessing Google Classroom, they could at least look at it. They could potentially, print it off. We did also have, we gave them the opportunity to come and collect resources from the school as well. So we said, well, we've got a room where you can come and collect exercise books and that kind of stuff, because we knew that there were some families that wouldn't have had access to anything like that, pens, pencils, that sort of thing. And I think the way that it will work now is that now that we know exactly who those families are who don't have that access, that we'll be dropping off stuff for them if needs be. So we've already done that a little bit for families where a child is having to isolate, but it isn't impacting on the wider school bubble. Whereas, at this school, the children live fairly close, so we'll just run it down the road to them and drop them off some books and some paper if we know that they need it.
That's fascinating background information. I think, you know, for a lot of people, it's an unknown. They hear about schools are continuing to offer education, and that word alone is so vast and covers so many different scenarios that the detail around children's basic requirements in order to function in that space, let alone the teachers and the staffing and the logistics. Yeah, that is quite scary actually to think about it. And in terms of staffing, presumably children coming in and out. I know from my own grandchildren's experience that the whole logistics of timings and ways in and ways out and times to drop off and times to pick up, how has that been?
I think what you find is that it's incredibly dependent on the context of the school and particularly the way that their site works. So the two schools that I've been involved in during this time have both been quite lucky in that they've got just very big sites, quite extensive grounds, and various points where children have entered the site, which means that they haven't needed to get into the staggered starts so much. It's certainly not something that we've been doing since September. It was something that schools were doing when schools reopened in the summer term, because that's what we were being told to do. The new guidance says that we have the flexibility to use staggered starts if necessary, and we feel, and I think the parents here agree, that it's safe for us to get all of the children onto the site to start at the times that they normally would start without needing to do staggered starts. But I could see that at a school that had one entry point, one gate, that you would absolutely need to do that, because otherwise you could have far too many people all in quite small spaces. We did ask parents to start wearing masks pretty quickly after they came back in September, so for drop-offs and pickups. So I think that helps. And I would have thought that it seems from what I can see from across our trust that most schools are heading in that direction, really.
Parents, I mean, that, you know, how has it been? I mean, there's probably some parents who are coping with this much better than others. They've got multiple children. That obviously has a huge impact. How have your parents been? I mean, that's a general question, but I'm sure there are some sort of points to consider.
Yeah, I think that there's been huge movement on that in that in the early days, the feeling I got from parents was that they were incredibly scared, and it was you know, in that week in March where before schools closed, and it was, you know, it's just the strangest time to, I mean, and I know this was the same for people in all sorts of jobs and walks of life, but as a teacher, just every day you'd come in and there'd be 5 less children in the class, and it was, you know, the attendance was just dropping by the day because parents were scared. And I think that isn't the case anymore. That, you know, parents know that children are best at school and they want them to be at school. The amount of parents that we're having that are nervous about children coming to school seems to really not be too many anymore. The challenge with parents is having that contact with them that we normally would do. So, you know, schools will be doing parents' evenings, would normally be doing parents' evenings in the autumn term, and those aren't happening. So there's been discussions in our trust about how those go ahead. So some schools are looking at doing telephone call parents' evenings, Zoom parents' evenings. Some schools are looking at almost doing an extra written report that then, you know, sort of covers the parents' evening. But it's all challenges for how you keep that parent communication going. And, you know, this is the school that I'm at now that has always done that very well. They've always had a sort of parents' welcome meeting in the first few weeks. All that goes. So keeping in contact with parents is tricky. And even, you know, speaking to a parent when they're wearing a mask at the end of the day and you know, standing a few meters away from them is not the same. And we're trying to limit those conversations. You know, we would always be very keen to welcome parents in and to chat with them about their children. So I think from a parent's point of view, it's almost that school is that little bit more distant, that children go there and they're in this building that the parent isn't allowed in. And then they come out again, and it just, I think that's probably the challenge for them.
Yes, I can imagine. And certainly in early years, and even year one of the children who were early years last year, that group, those 2-year groups, are probably potentially the most emotional in so many ways.
Yeah, and I think that the tragedy of all of this, really, the children that I feel the most sorry for are the children that have had to have some kind of transition within this time. So, those children that were in year 6 last year that went to secondary school without any of the normal, sort of things that they would normally do, the performances, the discos, the saying goodbye to your friends, all that kind of stuff. But also the children starting early years this year, because all of the normal transition things of, meeting your early years teacher when you're still at nursery, and then having your parents come into the classroom with you, and all of that had to be looked at. And I know there were schools that did sort of manage to do those things, but even then it's wearing masks and wearing visors, and it's not the experience you'd want for a 4-year-old on their first day of school. No, so
no. And those reception children who had less than 2 terms in reception and then no school, and then now they've gone back into year 1, which is inevitably going to be slightly more formal. They're all considerations, aren't they? And challenging. And some children will get more support from home and more understanding from home. All of that is tough. It's
yeah.
Really...
And I think because we know that year in early years is so important, that it seems like most schools are almost rolling that early years approach through, at least for the autumn term, before they start the more formal year 1 teaching. Actually, at this school at Downsbrook, we have shared classes for early years in year 1, so that actually lends itself really well to that those year 1 children can almost, to a certain extent, repeat early years and get those experiences that they missed out on. So that's really nice, going down there and having a look at those children. It's a really nice atmosphere.
You painted a really great picture, Joe, and I can imagine that people who haven't got that first-hand experience will now begin to understand and appreciate some of the challenges. I just wondered whether it's slightly contentious, but money, cost impact, because everything you've mentioned has not just happened. It will have an impact on staffing. Things like something I read the other day where, heating costs are going to go out of the roof because, windows open to try and keep airflow going, to turn your heating up. Presumably you're not being given a nice big fat check to cover all of this.
No, and I think that ultimately that will be for schools to cover. I mean, on the heating issue, we sent a communication out to parents at the beginning of this week saying, please send your children in big jumpers, in fleeces, make sure that they're as warm as possible, because we are going to have doors and windows open. So you're right, we're pumping heating out, and then we've got doors wide open. And this week is the week when it seems to have started to get really cold. It's going to be like this until February or March, you would have thought. So it's going to be an interesting winter.
And also, staff well-being, they must be working. They always work around the clock, but there's all the gaps to fill, the sort of shepherding of children and the supporting of children and the incidents that happen inevitably in any school, but in these situations where people still aren't quite sure how to behave. That must have a huge impact on staff meetings and general getting together of staff. How's that been? Yeah,
I think that I've been incredibly impressed with every single colleague that and working across 2 schools during this time that I've worked with, in terms of their determination to do the best for the children that they're working with, their professionalism, their work ethic, because it is incredibly difficult, and schools are under huge amounts of pressure. And not only are we being asked to catch these children up with the learning that they've missed, which is a really, really tricky thing to be doing, potentially 6 months of lost learning. If we could catch up 6 months of learning in half a term, then we would always be teaching at that pace. So it's not necessarily going to work that way, but we know that there are some children that have been affected more than others, so it's about identifying who those children are. But then there's also a huge impact on workload, because we're having to even more so now develop this sort of blended learning approach, where we know that there are from time to time going to be children at home who are not ill. They're at home because they're having to isolate, and they need education. They need to be set work. That work needs to be looked at, and so I would say that most teachers now are finding that sort of each week they might have a child in their class who's at home isolating, and they're having to set and plan and assess work for the 30 children in their class, and they're also then having to somehow adapt that work and set it and keep those children that are at home engaged. So I think the impact on workload from that perspective is quite significant.
Massive, absolutely massive. And again, I think people just don't appreciate that it's not a case of sending home a worksheet. There's so much more that goes into education, especially these days, where it's supposed to be hands-on and practical and allowing children to explore, rather than a specific set of tests or set of questions just to answer, especially for young children.
Absolutely. It isn't just, I'll print something out of a book and send that home, because that's not going to be the kind of quality that we want. And what we also need is for the learning that those children that are at home to be getting to mirror and to match what they're doing in school, so that then when they come back, they haven't done different work, they're not behind, they know what's going on, they've kept up with the curriculum. So it isn't just, let's just find something and send that home for them. It's really got to be quite thought through. In some ways, it will be, from a workload perspective, it'd be easier to have your whole class at home, because then you're setting all the work for them.
Even keel.
It's when you're trying to do the blended approach with some at home, some at school, that actually from a workload perspective, it is a challenge. And I sort of can only see that getting trickier as this term goes on.
Because it's also there an assumption that child or those children that are sitting at home for whatever reason are going to be receptive and supported and have access to all of the elements that make up for the provision when they're not in school. Assumptions are then inevitably made, because if you've sent that work home, well, then you're going to do it, aren't you? Well, actually, we've got 3 dogs running around and there's a baby and the heating broke or whatever. So yeah, I can see the challenges are huge for senior management in trying to orchestrate all of that, but then teachers and support staff and all of the people that already do an amazing job to support teaching and learning are having to take on an extra layer of, no pun intended, but another layer of clothing to cope with everything else that's coming their way too.
Another challenge that I think I didn't really think about until this term is that it comes at the planning stage as well, because when you're planning the work for the children in class, you need to be thinking, how can I quickly adapt this to send home? So if you're using a book that you've got 10 copies of in the class, and everyone's going to have a copy of it, or you're going to share a copy with a partner, if the children aren't at school, you don't have that resource. So unless you then have access to that remotely, then all of that learning goes out the window. So at the planning stage, we're having to think about, how can this work in the classroom, and then how could it be quickly adapted to work at home, or how could it work if we had all the children at home or a few of them isolating at home? So it's very different from that perspective.
Wow. Yeah, absolutely. And then assessing the children and all of that, which is important, but actually almost can be pushed to one side because we just need to get on with the day. And if we have to stop and start in order to accommodate some of the expectations maybe of the whole trust, who understandably want to have a bigger picture and an understanding of what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, from an assessment point of view, I think that it's been great to have STAR, in that STAR has really come into its own during this time, because I wouldn't have wanted to be assessing children with a paper-based test on the, we gave children STAR tests on the first week that they came back in September. And we also did STAR tests in July as well with the children that we had in school. But I wouldn't have wanted to be sitting them down and giving them a formal test. But I had no problem with giving them a a STAR test because the impact on the child is minimal. They enjoy doing it, and it takes them 20 minutes to half an hour. And then we immediately, within the first 2 weeks of them being back in September, we had great data that was really useful straight away. And then we even retested our year sixes just before half term, just almost to see whether anything had happened in those sort of 3-4 weeks that they'd been back at school. And then we've done another set of STAR tests this week as well. So I think STAR has been incredibly useful, incredibly valuable, because I imagine that there are schools out there that still don't have that information on how much learning has been lost and where those children are. And I feel like we're quite clued up on that now, really. That's
amazing. Well, thank you, Joe. I mean, it has been incredibly insightful, and I can hear that there's still elements of the unknown, and this wretched disease seems to be pushing that envelope all the time. If there was one thing that you would like to say and you had the power to change anything, is there something that you would like to maybe say to Mr. Johnson? Please, can we do this? Or please, can we not do this? Is there anything that springs to mind?
I think that, and I think we need to see how it goes, but I think that possibly statutory assessments this year are going to need to be looked at, I think, and Ofsted as well. Ofsted's meant to come back in January at a school that's in an Ofsted window, and schools are, as we've discussed, schools are working incredibly hard under very difficult conditions, and to have that extra pressure of statutory assessments when potentially you have so many children that may have missed learning, and we're in an area where cases have so far been relatively low, but
yes.
And so to compare a school here with a school in a different part of the country where they've had more children who've had to be off seems actually quite unfair. And so in terms of statutory assessments, I do think that they may need to be looked at. Also we have moderation for writing. So I work as a local authority moderator, and as far as we know, that's all still planned to be going ahead. I think that's going to be quite tricky for moderators to be going into schools in June, and that's obviously a big part of the statutory assessment process. So I think that needs to be looked at, really. We need to maybe see whether that could be paused for another year.
I think that's a reasonable request, and I think you're not alone. I've seen so many other teachers saying similar things about the parity of areas where children haven't been in as much, and as you say, in West Sussex we've been relatively lucky that there hasn't been the levels that other areas have had to cope with, but then also all of the additional workload that you've so clearly identified during our time here in the last 20 minutes. To load on anything else feels like an extra burden that's probably a little unfair.
Yeah, and I think that what we aren't saying is that we want to stop statutory assessment, and we don't want to stop Ofsted. It's that they maybe need to be paused for a little bit longer. I don't know if it's the right time yet for those things to be being picked up again. So absolutely. Hopefully they may be reconsidered. We'll have to see.
Definitely, and none of us know what the future holds. But I think that's a nice way to finish, really, in a conversation where you've identified so many elements of positive as well as difficult. It's not been all doom and gloom, and clearly it shows a team that works together regularly can weather the storm. And when you've got other schools in the trust that can support each other with ideas, with resources, with a shoulder to cry on, even if it's only virtually.
Yeah, absolutely.
It helps. So it's just, thank you very much for joining us.
No, you're welcome. Thank you.
If you enjoyed this episode of the Renaissance Space podcast, please check out the Education Joining the Dots podcast from our colleagues at GL Assessment. Thank you.